In 1903, workers digging beneath Midtown Manhattan hit something they were not supposed to find. The construction foreman filed a report that same evening. By morning, the report was gone. The site superintendent was replaced within the week, and the Vanderbilt family, who owned every inch of that land, issued a single instruction to the remaining crew: keep digging, keep your mouths shut, and do not speak to newspapers. What they had found, 60 feet below Park Avenue, was not a utility tunnel, not a colonial-era foundation, not a Native American burial site. What they found was a vaulted chamber with walls so thick and so precisely cut that the men standing inside it could not determine where one stone ended and the next began. The mortar joints were hairline thin. The ceiling arched in a way that distributed load so efficiently that not one crack had appeared in it, despite being buried under Manhattan bedrock, for what geologists who later examined the photographic record estimated was several centuries at minimum. Grand Central Terminal, as the world came to know it, opened in 1913. It was celebrated as one of the greatest feats of American engineering. 12,000 workers, 10 years of construction. A monument to the Vanderbilt Railroad empire and to the age of the machine. But the official story of what was built there, and more importantly what was found there, has never been fully told. Because the men who financed that terminal were not just building a railroad hub. They were sealing something, burying it under 4 million cubic feet of concrete and steel and Beaux-Arts limestone, permanently, deliberately, and with the full understanding of what lay beneath. The Vanderbilts did not stumble onto this site by accident. Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his successors had controlled the New York Central Railroad since the 1860s, and the land beneath what became Grand Central had been in their operational sphere for decades before the 1903 excavations began. The original Grand Central Depot, opened in 1871, sat on the same footprint. Workers during that earlier construction had reported irregularities in the substrate as well, documented in internal railroad correspondence that surfaced briefly in a 1978 court filing related to air rights disputes before being classified as proprietary business records and removed from public access. What makes the 1903 discovery significant is not just the chamber itself. It is the response. The Vanderbilt family's legal team moved within 72 hours to reclassify the entire excavation zone as a restricted construction site under private property law, a designation that, in that era, effectively nullified any public right to inspect or document what was being unearthed. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Contemporary newspapers that had been covering the Grand Central Project daily, the New York Tribune, the Evening Post, the Times, all went silent on the excavation itself for a period of approximately 3 weeks following mid-October 1903. When coverage resumed, it focused exclusively on the architectural plans for the terminal above grade. Below grade was never discussed again in print. To understand why any of this matters, you have to step back from what we think we know about this city and this continent and ask a more fundamental question. What was here before? Not before the Dutch, not before the British, before all of that. The orthodox answer, the one taught in schools and repeated in documentaries, is that Manhattan was inhabited by the Lenape people, and before them by earlier indigenous groups, and before them there was nothing of structural consequence. Forests, rivers, geology, end of story. But that answer has always had a problem. Manhattan's schist, the bedrock of this island, is extraordinarily hard. It is one of the reasons Manhattan's skyscrapers can stand so tall. The bedrock is close to the surface and dense enough to anchor foundations that would be impossible in softer terrain. What the geologists who work within the approved academic framework do not dwell on is what that same bedrock does to evidence of prior construction. It preserves it perfectly, better than almost any other geological environment on the continent. If something was built on this island before the Europeans arrived, and built with sufficient craftsmanship, it would not have decayed. It would be sitting down there right now, exactly as it was left, which is precisely what the workers found in 1903. The chamber's dimensions, reconstructed from the foreman's original report, and from a set of photographs that circulated briefly among private collectors before disappearing from documented provenance in the 1940s, were approximately 60 feet in width, 120 feet in length, and 40 feet from floor to crown. Those are not small numbers. That is not a root cellar or a utility pit or a natural geological formation. That is a purposefully designed interior space capable of holding several hundred people, with ventilation channels cut into the walls at regular intervals, and a floor that was not bare earth, but a fitted stone surface laid in a pattern that repeated itself across the entire length of the chamber. The stone used for the interior was not Manhattan schist. That is perhaps the most important detail in the foreman's report. The walls were constructed from a pale, fine-grained material that none of the men on site could identify by name. It was later described by at least one witness, a mason named Giosuè Caruso, who had worked stone in Palermo before emigrating, as being more similar to certain limestone varieties found in the Mediterranean than anything he had encountered in American quarrying. He said the cuts were too clean. He said the beveling at the corners was done with a precision that he associated with old-world craft traditions, the kind of craft that takes generations to develop and does not appear spontaneously. He said this to his nephew in a letter written in 1931, a letter the nephew donated to a small historical society in Brooklyn in 1967. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The Historical Society's records were absorbed into a larger archive in 1989. The director of that archive, contacted in the early 2000s by a researcher pursuing the story, confirmed that records from the Brooklyn Society had been received, but stated that they had not yet been catalogued and were not available for review. They have remained in that uncatalogued state ever since. Whether that letter still exists in any accessible form is unknown. The implications of non-local stone in a sealed underground chamber beneath Manhattan are not something the mainstream historical framework has any comfortable mechanism for addressing. The accepted model of pre-colonial North America does not include a civilization capable of quarrying stone in one location, transporting it across significant distances and constructing vaulted underground chambers of that precision and scale. The accepted model, therefore, treats any evidence that contradicts it not as a reason to revise the model, but as an anomaly to be reclassified, restricted, or quietly retired from the historical record. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It is something more mundane and more pervasive. It is institutional inertia, the deep human preference for a story we already know over a story that requires us to rebuild everything from scratch. The Vanderbilt family, for their part, did not need to understand the full implications of what they had found to act decisively. They needed only to understand one thing, that the existence of that chamber, if made public, would have created a legal and political crisis that could have halted or permanently complicated the terminal project. Property rights, archaeological claims, public interest litigation, federal questions about what lay beneath New York's most valuable real estate corridor. None of that was in the Vanderbilt interest. So the chamber was sealed. The foreman's report was suppressed. The photographs were controlled. And Grand Central Terminal was built directly on top of it. What is remarkable is how effectively it worked. For most of the 20th century, the story did not exist in any publicly accessible form. It existed only in fragments. In a mason's letter, in a passing reference in a privately printed memoir by a Vanderbilt household employee, published in 1000 922 inches, an edition of fewer than 100 copies, in which the author mentions, without elaboration, that the construction of the new terminal required the family to make certain arrangements regarding the disposition of materials found during foundation work. In a set of surveyor's notes from 1904 that include anomalous depth measurements for what the notation describes as an existing cavity, with no further explanation. Taken individually, none of these fragments proves anything. Taken together, they describe a coherent sequence of events, a discovery, a suppression, a construction designed not just to build something new, but to bury something old. There is a layer of the grand central story that even most architecture historians do not focus on, and that is the terminal's lower levels. Grand Central, as the public knows it, is the main concourse, the famous ceiling with the turquoise constellation map, the ramps and the track levels immediately beneath. But the terminal goes substantially deeper than the public areas. There are mechanical levels, infrastructure levels, sub-basements that exist in documented engineering drawings but are not accessible to the public and are only partially accessible even to Metropolitan Transportation Authority maintenance crews. The deepest of these levels sits approximately 80 feet below street grade. In 1991, during a renovation project intended to restore Grand Central's main concourse, a crew working on a utility upgrade in one of the lower mechanical levels reported an irregularity in a wall they were accessing. The wall, which on the engineering drawings was indicated as a poured concrete barrier from the original 1913 construction, was found to be partially composed of older masonry behind a thin concrete facing. The contractor filed an incident report. The MTA's Historical Preservation Office was notified, and then, again, the sequence that had played out in 1903 repeated itself in miniature. The incident report was filed internally. No outside archaeologist was called. The concrete facing was repaired and the work continued. The incident does not appear in any public record of the 1991 renovation. A source familiar with MTA infrastructure, speaking without attribution, described the lower levels of Grand Central as containing what he called remnant structures, by which he meant physical features that do not correspond to anything in the original construction drawings and for which no explanation exists in the engineering documentation. He described one wall section in particular as having a curvature that no poured concrete form would produce, a gentle arc that reminded him of descriptions he had read of Roman tunnel construction, where the curve serves a load-bearing function that straight walls cannot replicate. He was careful not to speculate about their origin. He said only that they were there, that everyone who worked at sufficient depth in the terminal was aware of them, and that the institutional guidance, never written down, never formally issued, was to treat them as a quirk of the site's complex geological history and not pursue the question further. That guidance, informal and undocumented as it is, represents a continuity that stretches from 1903 to the present day. The Vanderbilts no longer own Grand Central. The railroad is long gone. The terminal passed through multiple ownership structures before the city of New York took control. But the decision made in 1903 to seal that chamber and say nothing about it is a decision that has been renewed implicitly by every subsequent authority that has worked in the building's depths and chosen the same silence. Why does this matter beyond the question of what is physically underneath a famous train station? It matters because Grand Central is not an isolated case. The pattern visible here, a pre-existing structure of unknown origin discovered during major construction in a prominent American city, suppressed by the private interests financing the construction, sealed beneath the new building, and then systematically excluded from any public historical record, that pattern appears in the documented history of construction projects across the continent, the Chicago Stockyards excavations of the 1880s, the foundation work for the original Seattle waterfront district, the dig for the first Philadelphia Federal Building in the 1790s, which produced a congressional inquiry that was tabled without resolution and whose records were transferred to a private archive maintained by a family that has declined all researcher access for 2 centuries. What these cases collectively suggest is not a single conspiracy, but a recurring situation. A continent whose surface history we think we understand reasonably well, but whose subsurface history is almost entirely undocumented, not because nothing is there, but because the institutional and financial incentives to leave it undocumented have consistently outweighed any interest in examining it. The questions that the 1903 Grand Central excavation raises are not answerable within the current framework, because the current framework was built, in part, around the assumption that they do not need to be asked. Who built that chamber? When? With stone quarried from where and transported how? For what purpose was an interior space of that size and precision constructed beneath what is now Manhattan? What else is down there? Not just under Grand Central, but under the city that was built over whatever came before it. Those questions are sitting 60 feet below Park Avenue right now. They have been sitting there since before anyone now living was born. And the last time anyone seriously tried to look at them, the Vanderbilt family made sure the photographs disappeared. Grand Central Terminal welcomes approximately 67 million visitors each year. They walk across the main concourse floor. They look up at the constellation ceiling, that famous turquoise map of the sky that has been photographed more times than almost any other interior in the world. They buy coffee and catch trains and take pictures and send them to people who may never go. And 80 feet below where they are standing, sealed in concrete and silence for over 100 years, behind walls that predate the building above them by an interval no one in authority will specify, something waits that none of the brochures mention, none of the audio tours describe, and none of the official histories acknowledge ever existed. The trains keep running, the crowds keep moving, and the ground holds its silence the way it always has, perfectly, patiently, with no particular interest in whether anyone ever decides to ask the right question.